Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to today's webinar hosted by Transcelerate, titled Representation by Design, Enhancing Clinical Trial Access Through Multi-Stakeholder Collaboration. I'm Catherine Langridge and I'll be the facilitator for today's call. Next slide, please. So today I have the pleasure of introducing you to experts from a number of organisations: CTTI, the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative, Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA, READI, a newer initiative where READI stands for Research in Europe and Diversity Inclusion, and also experts from Transcelerate member companies. Each will share an overview of the work led by their organisation to support designing for representativeness and supporting clinical trial access. We will hear about both completed efforts and initiatives that are just about to start. The webinar will close with a panel discussion and where we'll hear from all representatives. And before I hand over to the experts today, I have a couple of slides on logistics and ground rules to cover. Next slide, please, Amber. Thanks. So we've got a rather large group today, so all attendees have been muted for the duration of the webinar, just to ensure a good experience for all. We do welcome questions throughout the webinar, and these can be submitted via the question icon on the GoToWebinar platform that hopefully you can see at the top right of your screen. There is also a handout available during this call, and again you can see that on the document icon at the top right of your screen, again in the webinar platform. The handout contains links and references to all of the solutions and work mentioned today, as well as additional resources created by the Transcelerate Diversity of Participants in Clinical Trials initiative. Finally, a reminder that this webinar may be recorded in whole or in part. Next slide, please. So a couple of ground rules to get us started. We want to make sure that this discussion is helpful and answer as many of your questions as we can. So a few ground rules at the front. So participation in this webinar is voluntary, as is using any of Transcelerate's assets or tools. The responsibility for compliance with laws and regulations is owned by the solution adopter. And you do not have to identify what company you work for during this webinar. There are a couple of things that we would ask you not to discuss today. So specifically, what vendors, sites, CROs, clinical trial sponsors you are working or not working with, and also any issues that you have with any of those stakeholder groups. Please also avoid discussing any long-term development plans and anything related to pricing or costs. On the flip side of that, there's a couple of questions we cannot speak to, so please don't ask about vendors, costs of using or implementing Transcelerate assets or tools, or which member companies are using those assets or tools. Next slide, please, Amber. So for those new to Transcelerate are up front. Transcelerate is a not-for-profit entity created to foster collaboration. Our vision is to improve the health of people around the world by accelerating and simplifying development of innovative new therapies. Next slide, please. So since 2012, passionate leaders and subject matter experts from our Transcelerate member companies have volunteered their time and expertise to design, develop and socialise solutions to advance the Transcelerate mission. Together, we've delivered over 500 solutions and implementation tools to address ecosystem pain points and transformational opportunities, and that's across preclinical, clinical and drug safety, all whilst prioritising patient needs. Most of our solutions are free for public download and use and can be accessed directly from the Transcelerate website. Next slide, please, Amber. So without further ado, I have the pleasure of introducing Binita Patel and Ubong Peters, the first of our expert speakers today. Binita and Ubong were part of Transcelerate's Diversity of Participants in Clinical Trial initiative and have joined us today to present an overview of the work completed by the team and to spotlight a couple of the more recently developed solutions and associated key learnings. Binita, I'll hand to you to get us started.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Hi, everyone. As Catherine mentioned, my name is Binita Patel. I'm a clinical trials representation lead at Bayer, and I'll be taking you through a whistle-stop tour of Transcelerate's initiative to enhance representation. in clinical trials. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we'll start at the top of the slide, and you'll see that in 2014, the work had already started at Transcelerate to understand how to involve underrepresented patient populations in clinical research. And this culminated in the development of better practice tools that some of you may have already used or be familiar with. The intention here was to provide tools for sites and sponsors to enable broader access to clinical trials, with suggestions that some of you are going to be familiar with now, such as and then if we fast forward to 2020 and we go further down the slide, you'll probably be aware, with an increased public discourse in representation in healthcare, for example, with triggers such as COVID, there was an increased interest in participant populations needing to be more representative of patient populations. So, for example, reflecting real-world disease demographics. And so Transcelerate then initiated in 2020 an exploratory analysis. And this is where the new work stream stems and leads to the outputs we're talking about today. And that was under the umbrella of the Diversity of Participants in Clinical Trials initiative. And if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So if we start from the right-hand side, the first arc in the lighter blue, is the Diversity of Participants in Clinical Trials Better Practice Materials, the work that was started in 2014. And then I mentioned the newer initiative, or the rebirth of that in 2020, following an exploratory analysis, and that led to two working groups, two parts of the initiative. The first one in orange you see is the race and ethnicity enrollment data benchmarking. And that is going to be discussed by Ubong a little bit later on. If we go further again onto the on the left-hand side, you see the collaboration hub. And this was designed to look at practical tools and insights to implement and understand, as well as operationalize strategies to improve representation in clinical trials. And that's the piece that I'll talk about a little bit further. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. We can just click through to the next slide. Okay, so this is a list of the activities and the tools that are available on the Transcelerate website. I'll start from if we take the left-hand side and go from the bottom up. What you'll see is tools were developed over the length or the time of the initiative being underway, and shows how knowledge has evolved and has been shared throughout the life of the initiative. So the reference table that you see right at the bottom shows links available at that time to resources and organisations that would support and can support gaining further knowledge on the subject of representation in clinical research. And it's ordered based on stakeholders in clinical research. So, for example, patients, sites, and sponsors' perspectives. Then if we go further up, a tool was developed, a reference document for the US regulatory landscape of that time, 2022, specifically on representation in clinical trials. And this was based on US regulatory policy and guidance, which supported enhancing recruited representative participants in clinical trials. The feedback for this was that it was a useful document as a reference to understand policy and the regulatory framework at the time to implement compliance strategies by sponsors. Then if we go further up, one of the tools which I think has been, feedback has shown that has been used fairly consistently, is a toolkit for at the program or the portfolio level to include considerations that enable users to consider implementation of representation strategy through the life cycle of clinical development. Going up to the middle now, there's two tools that are specifically around supporting sites. One for capacity building in the community, and the second one, which is much more about sponsors working with sites on engagement and building infrastructure that would support representation or enhancing the ability to recruit underrepresentation in clinical trials. So that takes us to the top of the list on the left, and these are the newer tools that have been developed. You'll see the very top one is the benchmarking metrics and analysis white paper, which Ubong will go through shortly. And underneath those two, you'll see there is an FDA diversity plan, early insights and considerations version 1, and that was done based on the insights from sponsors, member companies that were kind enough to submit to interviews. And these were aggregated to create an insights document. And that was followed up in 2020. That was followed up over 2 years later, so that the version 2 was published in 2024. And actually, you'll see the difference if you look between the two, between 8 companies completing a survey or interviews for the first document through to, I think it was 9 companies, and then 18 in the second one. So there's a lot more interest from sponsor companies, from member companies who were interested in participating. And then if we go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So version 2 was an aggregated collection of the insights and considerations from a number of member companies. And the idea of pulling this together was to understand from member companies how operational strategies were put together, and whether there were commonalities, challenges and differences in identifying how member companies were practically implementing regulation and policy to be able to produce diversity strategies. The intention for this document that it's fairly broadly used. We've found that it's pretty useful as a benchmarking tool, for example, to understand where other companies are out there. It's anonymous, but you'll see that moving into version 2, many more companies have infrastructure around inclusion and representation in clinical trials. And if we go to our next slide. Thanks very much. So these are really some of the key insights. And the first one really is that you'll see from the very first insights document, and this was really borne out again in the second version 2, that the tools that sorry, I'll start that again. So from April 2020, from the version 1 to the version 2, many more companies had implemented strategies to enhance representation in clinical trials. They may have started before then, but actually this really kind of kicked into gear following the April 2022 guidance. And I should say that there are links in the chat, in the material, so that you'll be able to look at all these tools. And then if you, thank you. If we go forward again, what we're also seeing, and I mentioned previously, is that many more companies following more experience and more time to interpret regulatory policy have created a governance framework and assigned dedicated resource to support implementation of representation in clinical trials. And then the last two are really around challenges and opportunities. Thank you. So one, which is a concurrent theme, and you'll hear a little bit more about today, is issues with data sources. And I think many who are already working in this space will be aware that one of the challenges is the lack of granularity, or sometimes difficulty in covering data accurately. For example, if they refer to aspects of representation slightly differently, particularly with challenges outside in understanding or identifying data sources even outside of the US. So there's still challenges in that area. And another piece that the team felt were further opportunities, and shown today in the discussion, is that there's opportunities for collaboration with stakeholders in healthcare to really understand and help drive strategies to support more comprehensive planning around representation in clinical trials for sponsors. And with that, I will now hand over to Ubong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Binita, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. My name is Ubong Peters, and I am a lead clinical scientist at Genentech, a member of the Roche Group, and I'm based here in San Francisco, California. I had the privilege of serving on the benchmarking and metrics working group that Binita just described. And today I am honored and delighted to present the solution we developed through quite a significant multi-year, multi-stakeholder collaboration. So on behalf of the benchmarking and metrics team, I'll be sharing highlights from our white paper titled Assessing Representational Diversity in Industry-Sponsored Clinical Trials in the United States. The paper describes the key findings from the analysis of aggregated historical enrollment data for diverse race and ethnicities, age, and sex as compared to disease prevalence data. It also aims to provide additional comparisons to improve data transparency and stimulate accountability in the ecosystem by highlighting the gaps in real-world prevalence data needed to address FDA guidance on improving representation in clinical trials. So the rationale for undertaking this work was to establish a current state benchmark to help understand industry-wide performance in terms of representative enrollment in clinical trials. Also, we wanted to identify opportunities to improve inclusion of underrepresented populations in clinical trials. So we believe this work should be of interest to everyone in the healthcare industry, particularly those listed here, because it represents a first of its kind industry-wide benchmark. All right, let's dive into the methods we use to execute this work. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So we aggregated clinical trial enrollment data from 334 clinical trials sponsored by 12 Transcelerate member companies across 7 disease areas listed here. That is breast cancer, lung cancer, prostate cancer, multiple myeloma, atopic dermatitis, multiple sclerosis, and systemic lupus erythematosus. As you can imagine, it was quite a heavy lift to work with these 12 pharma companies to ingest the enrollment data of all their completed trials between 2011 and 2021 in those disease areas. And this amounted to nearly 120,000 global patients. From that primary data set, we then analyzed the demographics data extracted from 27,000 plus US patients that participated in those clinical trials. And we compared the results to real-world data, focusing on race, ethnicity, age, and sex. And in terms of real-world data sources that we used, we relied on SEER, TriNetX, Optum, and a US-based electronic health records database as benchmarks for our analysis. Next slide, please. So here is a brief summary of our key findings. More diverse representation was seen in the autoimmune disease trials, while sex representation aligned with benchmarks for all the indications in our study. For the next text box, across most oncology indications, clinical trials had an overrepresentation of white patients and patients aged between 18 and 64. Racial and ethnic minority patients were underrepresented in most oncology trials, and patients older than 64 years were also underrepresented in those trials. So we identified data gaps on patients whose race and ethnicity were unknown or not reported. And these data issues permeated both the clinical trial data as well as the real world data sources we used as benchmarks. So future research is needed and more robust efforts from industry, government, regulatory agencies, and academia to help improve the collection of standardized demographic data in order to close the gap between trial representation and the epidemiology of disease. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and it's a call to action to all of us to commit to ensure that patients that participate in clinical trials are reflective of the patient population in the real world. And we call on all stakeholders to leverage and implement the tools we've described in this talk to enhance scientifically driven representative research. Please utilize these tools to support and standardize the collection of race and ethnicity data to ensure consistency and accuracy. And most importantly, we must reduce the volume of race and ethnicity data reported as unknown or unreported in clinical trials, as well as in the real-world data sources, so that we can accurately calibrate trial representation. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And with that, I'll hand it over to Catherine.
Thank you, Ubong. And thank you to you and Binita for providing a great overview of the Transliterate Diversity of Participants in Clinical Trial Initiative and some further insights from those specific solutions, the considerations document and the benchmarking analysis. I now have the privilege of introducing the guest speakers for today's webinar. So as you can see, Sabrena Mervin-Blake from Citi is joining us, as well as Carla Rodriguez-Watson from the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA, and Alberto Borobia from IHI READI. Each of our guest speakers will provide an overview of the work their organisation has conducted in this space, and then they'll join us for our panel discussion. So with that, I'll hand over to Sabrena. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. I'm Sabrena Mervin-Blake. I'm Senior Project Manager with the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, also known as Citi, and I'm certainly delighted to be a part of the webinar today. I'll start this morning with a brief overview of Citi and then share a few points about some of our previous work. So Citi is a public-private partnership co-founded by Duke and the FDA, with a mission to develop and drive adoption of practices that will increase the quality and efficiency of clinical trials. Citi also, as a member organization, we're made up of a group of dedicated individuals and organizations, including academia, investigators, government and regulatory, industry, patient advocacy groups, and other groups who are committed to changing and improving clinical trials. So through our projects and our convenings, that are often centered around topics that are recommended by either our FDA partner or our steering committee or executive committee or executive director, we develop tools and recommendations that are evidence-based and helps to shape policies and procedures across the clinical trials enterprise. And related to the topic of today's webinar, representation by design, some of our previous work include the Convergence Project. This project is a partnership with MRCT, Faster Cures, and National Academies. And it stemmed from an acknowledgement that there has been and is still a lot of ongoing great work by many organizations focused on improving representativeness in clinical trials. However, often the work is being done in silos, and we may not be aware of the work. So during our conversations, we recognize that in order to gain a broad, system-wide, sustainable changes, it would require collective action across all clinical trial partners to work together and converge on many areas across the drug development process. So then through a series of convenings and with representatives across the clinical trials enterprise, the Convergence Project, we aligned on 8 domains for improving representativeness in clinical trials. And then within those 8 domains, we described common goals associated with each domain and collective actions necessary to achieve those goals. And as I noted, all these goals and collective actions will support a system-level sustainable change, but only if we come together and converge around those goals. On the slide, on the left side of the screen, you see those 8 domains listed in the infographic, starting with public awareness and communication at the top, and then community engagement and investment, and so on. So this Convergence Project is meant to inspire organizations to work together towards common goals and then commit to taking collective actions around each of these domains. And ideally realizing that no single clinical trial partner organization can by themselves take on this level of system-wide and sustainable change, and it will require all of us to come together. A second project I'd like to mention released recommendations and a maturity model in May of 2023. The recommendations were developed to help clinical trial-related organizations who were ready to commit to developing an organization-wide infrastructure and adopt new organizational level strategies and practices that would support improving equitable access and participation in clinical trials. So as noted in the center of the slide, the maturity model infographic provides a guide for research organizations to assess their current organizational infrastructure for increasing diversity in clinical trials, and then identify a desired future state. So the maturity model focuses on 8 elements, and those are couched within those 4 broader categories of commitment, partnerships, resources, and accountability. And those are, again, the organizational level infrastructure. And the 8 elements are aligned with the recommendations. And lastly, I'll just mention in November 2023, Citi co-hosted with the FDA a public workshop to enhance clinical study diversity, which was required by the Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act, or FDORA, of 2022. So these are just a couple of examples of some of Citi's work in the past and previous work, and this information, additional information, can be found on Citi's website and any associated reports. So I'll stop here and I'll pass it over to Carla from Reagan-Udall Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabrena, and thank you to Catherine and to Transcelerate for this opportunity for this discussion, and to you all for coming today to this to share in the conversation. So I'm Carla Rodriguez-Watson. I'm the Director of Research at the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA. And if you've never heard those words strung together before, we are actually the FDA's foundation. We are an independent nonprofit uniquely created by Congress to help the FDA do more to protect and promote the public health. And we really do that through 3 main pillars of activities. The first is in evidence generation, where we help advance regulatory science, primarily through things like the convenings that we bring, that we engage on, that we bring different stakeholders together to talk about how things like how to operationalize guidance, as well as our own IMEDS program, the Innovation Medical Evidence Development and Surveillance Program, where we leverage the FDA Sentinel tools and make them available to private sector, both for-profit and nonprofit, to leverage those query tools in a distributed framework, because only the FDA can query Sentinel. We also engage in facilitating engagement and information exchange, much like I said, these convenings. In fact, we're having one right now on produce safety. We engage the entire FDA's portfolio, as well as supporting development of reliable information and exchange. So 2 of those things that you see here, examples are the Science of Vaccines project that we have and the RAISE program that we ran over the last 2 years. So What brings me to this conversation today is really my experience in real-world data over the last 25 years. The current U.S. health data system provides a limited support to fully characterize the populations affected by different conditions for whom we are trying to develop medical product, both therapeutics, diagnostics, and to provide care. Because remember, our systems were developed for billing and for tracking providers panel, not for tracking patients. And this really came to head, as we all saw during the pandemic, where even for confirmed COVID cases, the CDC reported that only 62% of confirmed COVID cases also reported race or ethnicity, which are mandatory required reporting to public health. This, as you can imagine, has echoes in the real-world data system, which we rely on, particularly claims data, for doing post-market safety surveillance. So we wanted to do something to address that gap in missing data. So we launched two things here, right? We realized that in order to better collect these kinds of data, we had to reach out to folks early in their education to start training them on the importance of person-centered data to enable full characterization of people, of the population that have certain indications, and to engage them in clinical trials. And also we knew that there were solutions out there already, so we needed a forum to bring experts together and just share information. So we launched in 2021 the RAISE program with the initial thought that, the first step in collecting these kinds of person-centered or demographic data would be for race and ethnicity. And so the purpose of RAISE was really to elevate collection, curation, exchange of race and ethnicity data. But the model is transferable to other demographic and social needs data needed to fully characterize the population. Because if we don't know who is affected, then we cannot, as Ubong I think described, can't appropriately recruit them for trials. And in the RAISE program, we developed an action framework, which includes steps that this community came together and prioritized to be able to better collect the demographic data needed to describe the population. And so within the action framework, which you can see in the materials that have been included with this webinar, we provide examples of organizations that are leveraging the priorities that our community, the RAISE community, identified to advance the data systems and the collection, curation, exchange of demographic data. And we encourage you to, the action framework was initially developed for healthcare delivery systems, but we are producing one that is for payers as well, and hoping that anyone can download these materials. That are available on our Reagan-Udall.org website. The link is in the materials provided. The second thing that we did is also launch the Science of Vaccines. It was really about developing credible, evidence-based information about how the immune system works, how vaccines work with the immune system, how vaccines are developed and regulated. So this is encouraging and sparking. This project is geared towards a middle school age population. We chose middle schoolers because we wanted to reach up, a reading level, which is also common for the entire U.S. population. The U.S. population reads on an average fifth grade, the average U.S. population reads at a fifth, sixth grade level. So hitting middle schoolers, particularly when their learning standards include science-based information about the immune system, seemed like a perfect approach. And so through some independent funding by the Burroughs Wellcome Fund and the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation, we were able to launch this project in the North Carolina school systems that we developed this curriculum. And if you scan the QR code that's available there, you can get to a registration site that allows you access to the platform. The platform, the focus of it really is these short 90-second videos that are TikTok and Instagram friendly, so that they can engage students in the material about the immune system and how vaccines work with it. Important there is that we developed this program alongside teachers. We ran a number of focus groups with these teachers, found out how to engage engage them with the material through their school system, what material they wanted to see included, as well as how they wanted it presented. The three things we heard from them is that we should include learning standards and map the activities and the videos that we develop to those learning standards. We should make it fun and interactive, and we should let the students see themselves in the material. So key to that is that we include a science communicator and a social media influencer, Dr. Raven Baxter, who is also known as Raven the Science Maven, to do these fun, short, sassy videos, 90 seconds max for the students, but also a little bit long form for the teachers to provide, the necessary background information on these pretty significant topics. We include history of vaccines, which is long and very diverse, from China to Africa to many different examples over the years of how the history of vaccines and how they came to be. It was received tremendously. The teachers were really excited, and importantly, we showcased this at a Science for All Summit in North Carolina. And again, so important to engage. The purpose of this all is engaging youth at an early age, getting them interested in science, STEM activities, so that one day they get to a position where they, if they're ingrained early enough, understand the interconnection between these different characteristics, population characteristics, and how that plays with health, and the importance of the data so that we can describe these populations properly, fully, and know who to target and make inclusive for our trials, so that we can expand coverage, we can expand the label, we can make providers comfortable with being able to recommend and prescribe therapeutics for their populations because they know that they were represented in the studies. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Alberto Borobia. Alberto, will you pick up the mic?
Hello, thank you, Carla. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Translate, for inviting me to join this webinar. As a short introduction, my name is Alberto Borobia. I am medical doctor, a specialist in clinical pharmacology and head of the clinical trial unit at La Paz University Hospital. That is one of the biggest and most important hospitals in Spain. And since January 2025, I am also the coordinator of a READI project. That is the reason why I'm here today in this webinar. So, READI project. The READI project is a European project, a public-private partnership funded by the European Commission with a budget of 67 million euros and the participation of 73 institutions across 18 countries in Europe and in America. Our project has a budget of 67 million euros, as I have mentioned, and is probably the largest IHI project in terms of participants and also in the participation of the patients organization in a European project. The main objective of our project is to improve the inclusion of underserved and underrepresented population in clinical studies by integrating key stakeholders and providing tools, training programs, innovatives and other strategies to increase the participation of this population. We have structured our project in 4 main pillars. The first pillars, that is understanding and characterization of underserved, underrepresented population in clinical studies. The idea of this first pillar is to identify what is the usual underserved population in on the European level, but also at country level, and also to identify the underrepresented population focus in the different development of drugs in the different diseases. The pillar 2 is focusing co-creating a new methodological approach and tools to design and conduct more inclusive clinical studies. I'll go into more detail about this pillar in the next slides. Pillar 3, that is the community engagement and capacity building, that the idea is to have a real network of sites in Europe with the capability to use all the tools that we will develop in the READI project in order to increase the participation of underserved and underrepresented population. Pillar 4, that the idea is to demonstrate that all the tools that we will develop are really useful in the clinical practice by the development of at least 4 clinical studies. And we have also 3 transversal work packages, 8, 9, and 10, more focus in the ethical analysis and regulatory compliance, communication, dissemination, and the coordination one. Next slide, please. Okay, regarding pillar 2, that is focus in the development of all these tools that will need to increase the participation of underserved and underrepresented population. Work package 2 is focused in the development of a patient-centric multi-stakeholders digital platform. The idea is to have a platform that can complement the register that we use usually here in Europe, CTTI, clinicaltrials.gov, and in collaboration with pharma companies and the other stakeholders that belong to our project to have a platform that will provide more information to all the patients and with the idea to increase the information and the knowledge in clinical trials and the different clinical trials and increase the participation of this population. Work package 3, that is more focused in design or explore new designs of clinical trials, to develop new guidelines, and also to identify barriers that usually we have in the recruitment of patients and focus in develop these new tools. We will focus in some elements of decentralization of clinical trials, but not only in telemedicine, home visits, etc. So the idea is to develop in collaboration also with the regulators in new designs and new guidelines to have more inclusive designs of clinical trials. Finally, in the work package 4, we will first of all map all the trainings that are available related to clinical research and mainly in clinical trials in the inclusion of underrepresented and underserved population in clinical trials, and also develop new educational and training materials supporting also by a virtual learning platform, and focus not only in the patients but also in the clinical sites, researchers, and also other usual stakeholders that are involved in clinical research. So in conclusion, our project is focusing identify what are the usual underserved and underrepresented population in clinical trials in Europe, identify the barriers, and develop new tools, new designs, and new innovative, taking into account the contribution of all stakeholders involved in clinical studies. Thank you very much. And now I pass to my colleague, Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto, and thank you to all of the guest speakers for providing an overview of the work. I can now lead us into our panel discussion, as we've heard from all organisations presented. So before we go into the discussion, I have a quick disclaimer. So responses have been sourced from a variety of panellists and do not necessarily represent the views of all or their respective organisations. Okay, so now I've done the disclaimer. You can see a new face on the screen. So obviously we have Carla, Sabrena and Alberto rejoining us. We also have Ruma Bhagat joining us, who was part of the Transcelerate Diversity of Participants in Clinical Trials initiative. So welcome, Ruma, and happy to have you join the panel discussion. Before I kick off and start with the first question, I just wanted to kind of highlight what's already been said. It's been really great working with and hearing from this group in the prep sessions, and I've personally really enjoyed it. So thank you again for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us and collaborate on this call. It's really appreciated, and I'm looking forward to hearing your additions. So I will jump into the first question, and this is certainly one that we had a good amount of discussion on during the prep session. So it would be great to hear, well, I guess that seems like a great place to start. So the first question is, how do we plan for success across clinical trial partners from the start? And Sabrena, it would be great to come to you on this one. I know during your overview of some of the work that you've done with Citi, you mentioned the importance of collaboration across clinical research partners. So if I can hand to you first.
Sure, yes, thank you. I just noticed my camera went off. So yeah, I think, to your point from the beginning, I think each clinical trial partner needs to understand that everyone is accountable for successful trials, and that the responsibility doesn't rest with one group, as I mentioned earlier from our Convergence project. And that may mean doing something different or in addition to than what groups, organizations have done before. If you're used to, protocol design or site management, or just think about how you can come together and work together to do something different instead of thinking or operating as if, I've done my part and I'm going to pass it on to the next person to do their part. But we all maintain the accountability across the board from throughout the whole drug development process. And the second thing I would mention is it really is important for sponsors to be involved and committed to long-term sustained engagement and investment with patient and local communities as is feasible. We realize sponsors can't get out and be everywhere, but maybe consider partnering with other sponsors in engagement and doing something together and broader across communities. It's also important to commit to a budget for sustained investment within community and developing community programs. And that indeed helps to build trust, even if the return on investment is not immediate. We hear that often. Well, what's the ROI for being in the community, and what's the ROI? But I heard at a recent conference that the initial immediate ROI is relationship and trust building, which will support a financial ROI in the future. I'll also mention, I think, to ensure success in the beginning, that it's important to clarify understandings and needs of roles, responsibilities, and expectations across all clinical trial partner groups throughout the process, and to plan early how to address issues and pain points that's experienced from each organization, and not to operate in silos and with assumptions, but really working together, again, understanding what sites may need, what sponsors need, what CROs needs, what our community needs. Then the last thing I'll mention, I can't thinking about success from the beginning is during the trial design process is how do we design trials keeping the patient burden in mind? How do we limit the burden on the patient in terms of participation in trials? So I'll stop there.
Can I jump in on this one, Catherine?
Yeah, please do. I was going to say, you go ahead.
Yeah, I want to echo, thank you, Sabrena, for raising all those great points. And what I heard from you say is really about community-driven design, and like really engaging the community as partners. And that long-standing ROI, like you said, so important for the relationship and trust building, but then so that there's infrastructure to provide care, particularly in under-resourced communities, and engage in that care and the continuing collection of data that is needed to provide care, and to eventually return for additional trials, either by the one sponsor or another sponsor, and really as engaging in shared risk benefit is how these communities will see a return on the investment. I think some of the models that are out there that were surfaced during our RAISE series of workshops included those from Variant Bio, as well as EQB Med, that program, and the READI program that Alberto talked about. I think, again, community-driven, developing young investigators early so that all different communities are exposed to what clinical trial work is like, how to engage patients and their communities in these important studies is key for success.
Thank you, Carla. And you've sort of led me on to my next, I guess, victim in Alberto. I would love to hear from the READI perspective if and how this has been discussed as part of your work packages and that building from the beginning across partners.
Yes, so I think that if we are talking about how success, I think that it's necessary firstly to define what reportment annotation success is. Then it's also relevant to understand which goals must be drafted to ensure success, but not only from a technical or a scientific point of view, but also under a social point of view. This is the reason why in our consortium we have involved probably all the stakeholders that usually are participating in clinical studies. We have 73 institutions, participants, including patients and organizations, clinical sites, researchers, universities, regulators. So we put together all the expertise and all the needs of the stakeholders to work in identify what are the barriers of participation of those populations that usually are not included in clinical trials, or because they are underserved population, are European or at country level, or they are underrepresented usually in each specific clinical trial for each specific disease. So we need to work together to identify these barriers, and also in order to not only develop new tools, because there are a lot of tools developing, a lot of trainings, a lot of initiative. It's important to work together all these initiatives and use all these tools in order to put in the center the patients, improve the selection, recruitment, and retention of this population.
Thanks, Alberto. And yeah, completely agree. And I think this webinar is a great way to highlight some of the collaboration that's ongoing. So thank you. Ruma, I can see you're off mute, so I would love to understand your perspective here.
Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to chime in. I'm Ruma Bhagat. I'm a Senior Director in the Global Health Equity Population Science team at Roche Genentech. Focus of my work is around ensuring that we enroll representative patients. And it was great to see in the latest ICH E6 R3 guidelines that everything that was just mentioned by our esteemed panelists is included. So, the guidelines state that the design and conduct of the trial should be supported by obtaining the perspectives of interesting parties like patients and communities. The input will help reduce unnecessary complexity and improve feasibility and likelihood of meaningful trials. It talks about innovative trial designs and technologies to help with the inclusion of wider and more diverse populations that broadens the applicability of the outcomes. And it specifically calls out the scientific goal and purpose should be carefully considered to not unnecessarily exclude particular patient populations. So all of this work that we've been doing And, the approach to making sure that we have representative population is also included in something which is foundational to our work in the ICH guidelines. So I just wanted to sort of, share that with the audience, that, representation by design, as is the topic of our webinar today, is really something that is also a part of good clinical practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruma. And I know that was sort of a common pre-registration question. So thank you for pulling that through into your response. Appreciated. Unfortunately, we are coming towards the end of today's webinar. I know that attendees have heard a lot today, so I would love to go through the panelists, and maybe we go in the same order as previously, and just ask each of you to share sort of what is the one key takeaway for you from your perspective from today's discussion. If attendees are only to remember one thing, what would it be? So Sabrena, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I think I'll go back and really highlight something that I think we all have already said, and that is to recognizing that it really does take all of us, and it may require us to do things differently than we have done in the past. We know we've had this concern issue around representation for a long time. This is not new. So we can't continue as we always have. So just think broadly and innovatively. How can we do things differently? Who do we work with differently so that we can really, improve representativeness long term?
Thanks, Sabrena. Carla.
So I got to answer in a follow-up to Sabrena's, and of course, my bias in leveraging real-world data. I think, looking at different partners, there's a lot of different partners that will benefit from improving person-centered demographic data in real-world data sets. There's the health system, the payer system, and of course, the trial infrastructure. And so by improving those data, and the many incentives that are out there to improve those data, including those that come from CMS and the value-based systems, that will enable better characterization of populations, that will inform better trial design, not just inclusion-exclusion criteria, but different aspects of trial design for clinical trials. So I think finding those partners, improving those data that has maximum return, not just for the trials, but for care for these patients, is key. Back to you.
Thanks, Carla. And data has certainly been a theme throughout today's webinar, so I'm glad someone called that out. Alberto.
So I think that under the perspective from a European project, we have a lot of things to learn about all the US experience. There are a lot of tools, a lot of initiative regarding this topic, and I think that we have a lot of things of learn. And we have here, and regarding, for example, the use of world real data, we have here some challenges because we are in Europe, 27 countries with different healthcare systems, with different epidemiological data system. So it's for us a very challenge to include all this information, to use this information in order to increase the participation of underserved and underrepresented population. And we have a lot of things to learn from all this initiative.
Thanks, Alberto. And last but not least, Ruma, you've got a sentence to wrap us up.
Yes, well, representative patient data is possible, and this is the place where we need to innovate and think broad end to end. And I'm looking forward to what's next for all of us to ensure and make that possible.
Thank you so much, Ruma, and thank you again to all panelists. We really do appreciate your support and collaboration to bring this session to life. So thank you for taking your time out.